Good evening, folks. Welcome to the Starkville Planetarium. My name is Eric Johnson. I'm the director of the planetarium. So glad you're all here this evening to join us for the James B. Kaler Science Lecture Series. This lecture series started off as World of Science, and each year, during the academic year, we invite a person who's going to be a content expert in various fields of science from our community to come and share their knowledge or what they're researching. So in this case, we are actually inviting a person whose main avocation is actually what you see up on our dome right now. It's about birds. If you're curious about who James Kaler was, Jim was actually a professor of astronomy at the University of Illinois, and he was a routine lecturer during this World of Science lecture series. He mostly talked about astronomy, but he often talked about various concepts of what you'd see in the sky. There was a really neat talk he gave a few years back about atmospheric phenomena, okay? And it was just a lovely talk to see what you can find just in the regular sky. Anyways, the speaker for this evening is Jeffrey Bryant. Jeff here has a master's degree, is it astrophysics, I believe? Physics and astronomy. Oh, they're separate. Okay, over at Ball State University. And immediately after completing his graduate work, he had joined Wolfram Alpha here in town. So he's been in Champaign for over 20 years. And in his growing love of photography, he has not just taken those cameras and pointed them up in the night sky, but he also points them off at birds. And this here is a collection of bird photos that he has presented to our Kaler Lecture Series audiences in past years. So to kind of change things up a bit, his talk this evening is going to be about unusual birds you wouldn't often expect to find in East Central Illinois. All right. So Jeff is actually working with his wife, the planetarium's producer, Waylena McCulley, to have all this up on the dome. She encoded all of this that you are seeing up here right now, and she had an integral part of getting Jeff to come here and to getting Jeff's work to be presented to the public. So without any further ado, I'm going to step aside. I'm going to take off this lovely little gallery that you're all getting to enjoy, and I will let Jeff have the floor. Jeff, thank you so much for coming to present to us once again.
All right, thanks, Eric. All right, so just out of curiosity, I want to kind of get a feel for the audience here. How many of you consider yourselves to be birders? There's a few handful of people up. Okay. How many of you have actually been out on a public bird walk? About the same people? Okay. So just so you know, if some of these faces I don't recognize, so we do public bird walks here in town. In fact, they've just started last week, and they go on every Sunday at 7:30 in the morning. We meet in the Anita Purvis Nature Center over at the entrance to Busey Woods. And usually we walk there for from 7:30 to 9:30 or so. And sometimes we have extra people go on after the official bird walk ends, and we go into Busey Woods. So I encourage anybody that's interested to feel free to attend those public bird walks. They're free, and allows you to get a good feel for the types of things that you can see here with a guide from people that kind of know what's already here. If we could bring the lights up just a little bit before we shut the lights off. I just wanted to show real quick, most of the pictures you're going to see here were all taken with the same camera. And so this is the camera that I typically use when I've taken all my bird pictures. This is a Canon 7D Mark II. Not sure if they still make this anymore because a lot of the modern cameras have gone mirrorless. So this was the last, one of the last digital single lens reflex, so DSLRs. Most of the ones they have now do not have a mechanical mirror that swings out of the way. So. Yeah, sure. So the lens that I've got on here is also a Canon lens. This is a 100 to 400 millimeter lens. You get much bigger than this, and you have to start taking out a loan at the bank. So this is why I don't have a lens bigger than this, because it's about as much as I can justify with this just being a hobby. So, and I should emphasize that I am not a professional photographer. I do not get paid for this. This is just something that I had a computer job, and I wanted to get out away from the computers occasionally and get some physical activity. And so I started honestly, as Eric mentioned, I actually started with some astrophotography back in the old film days. And when digital cameras started kind of coming around, I actually didn't start with birds. I didn't know much about birds. And it wasn't really until 2014 that I started looking at birds. But that previous year, I actually started with macro photography. I was more interested in insects and like close-ups of flowers. But then that first winter came, everything died. It's like, what do I take a picture of now? I didn't know what to use it for. They weren't good enough for astrophotography, in my opinion, at the time. So it's like, well, I'll just set the camera and wait for the next summer. But then I started looking out the window and I started paying attention to birds, and I started seeing birds in my own backyard that I had never seen before. And so that's what piqued my interest. It's just kind of noticing what's around you if you look for it. A lot of people just don't even bother to pay attention. So it's really important to look and pay attention. The bird walks are a really good way to see what's around there and to have people point things out that you might not notice. So anyway, I wanted to show the camera before we shut the lights off completely here. These first couple pictures, I should emphasize that when I say unusual birds, that can have many different meanings. Unusual does not mean endangered. It can mean endangered. It just means you're not likely to see it for whatever reason. It could be seasonally. It's not here all year round. It's only here for part of the year. It could be it's endangered. It could be that you're just in the wrong environment. It's like if you go to Meadowbrook Park, you're likely going to see very different birds there than if you go to, say, a wetland area like St. Joseph Wetlands. And so uncommon birds are ones that if you're just a backyard birder, you're probably not going to see these birds. And there's a lot more birds that I could show you in this talk. I just don't have the time. And honestly, if they're very unusual, I may not have a picture of them yet. So I'm still trying. So I want to start out just very basic. These are not particularly exotic birds, but the bird on the left is not a great picture. And I've actually seen them quite a bit. I'm going to zoom in on the left here a little bit. It's not going to get any sharper, but at least it gets bigger. This is a brown crow. So everybody here is familiar with the American crows we get in our backyards and all around the neighborhoods. They're very loud, quite big in some cases. But they're actually, at least in southwest Champaign, seems to be a little subpopulation of brown crows. And this is actually a form of what's called leucism. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I don't think it's leucism. It's spelled with a L-E-U-C, so I think that's leucism. That's how I pronounce it anyway. And this is actually one of the best pictures I've been able to get. I often see them while I'm driving around in town, but I never have my camera. And of course, if I try to stop in the middle of traffic and take a picture, I'm going to have an accident. So I actually saw one today when I came home from lunch in my neighborhood. But this is one of the pictures I was able to get, and you can kind of see that it's not pitch black like most crows are. It's actually brown. Hopefully I'll get a better picture of them one of these days. Crows actually don't like to have their pictures taken. They're actually very observant. If they see you looking at them, they'll often fly away. So let's see. Now, the bird on the right was actually taken by one of the student workers here. Her name is Faith, and she took this picture right outside the window here in the office out at the bird feeder. Now, lighting isn't great here, but this is a bird that if any of you guys do consider yourselves birders, you're quite familiar with this. It's called a dark-eyed junco. Dark-eyed juncos, sometimes they're called snowbirds. They are only here in the winter, but they're very common in the winter. They're just kind of a white on the bottom, gray on top for the most part. But this bird was a little interesting, and if you can look closely here, I'll zoom in, see if it makes it a little bit more obvious. This bird is not all gray. You can see a little bit, if you look at the bottom near its feet, you can see there's a little bit of that white underneath, its white belly. But then on top of its head, it's kind of this mottled white. That white is not typical for juncos. Juncos are usually called dark slate juncos, the ones that you usually see around here. They're just a very dark gray with white underneath. And this one here is particularly interesting. Once again, this is another case of leucism. Leucism is not something unique to birds. There's all kinds of animals. Extreme leucism, I guess you could say that albinos are the most extreme form. It's just a pigment anomaly. So there's a whole population, or at least there used to be at BC Woods, of chipmunks. And some of them were pure white. And some of their offspring were kind of patchy white and stuff. And I think there might even still be some there. But red-tailed hawks, there's lots of different types of birds that seem to be fairly common with having various levels of leucism. So we'll start off with those basic, not great examples, but things that you can see if you look for them. There we go. This is a bird. I'm going to zoom in on this one before we focus too much on the others that are on the screen at the same time. This is a bird that's relatively common, especially if you have a bird feeder in your backyard or you're near trees. This is called a white-breasted nuthatch. They're fairly common here. They're kind kind of noisy and raucous. They make kind of a honking sound, or a yank. They call it a yank, 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 yank. And they kind of move up and down the barks of trees, and they will often come to peanut feeders. They'll grab a peanut, fly to a tree, and kind of hide it in the bark, and then go back for it later. These are fairly common. The reason I wanted to include it is not because it's an unusual bird, but because there is another version that is a little bit more uncommon, and that's the ones you see on the center and on the right. These are called red-breasted nuthatches. These are a more northern version of the nuthatch, and they only come down about, well, irregularly. It's called their eruption years. And during eruption years, you can actually get quite a few of these red-breasted nuthatches come in. And you can see that the head is definitely much more prominently streaked black and white, and underneath is kind of this rusty red color, but the black feathers, or the back feathers, are still kind of that slate blue color. So these are pictures taken from our peanut feeder in our backyard. So if you get them and you have feeders, it's not uncommon to find them in your backyard. But I didn't see a single one in the last 2 years, though I heard one. I didn't see it. But sometimes you'll get a bunch of them. Okay, this is a type of bird that's actually relatively common, but not in the form that you see here. These are both examples of red-tailed hawks. But the ones you typically see here in the eastern half of the United States, typically those red-tailed hawks have a mostly white front with a belly band of spots across the front of them. And they have the bright red tail, of course. These are often what's called a western red-tailed hawk. The species that you get out west often have much darker variants. There's a lot of variation in red-tailed hawks. Sometimes they even refer to them as races. If you go to the far north, you sometimes get what are called Kreider's hawks that are almost pure white. But it's not a form of leucism. It's just they blend into their environment and they've adapted. Some of the western species, like you see here, they have very dark. If you look at the one on the left here, I'm going to zoom in. If you look closely at its tail, it's got a kind of a pinkish hue. That's probably not a completely adult bird yet, but it's got a little bit of a reddish tint to it. So you can see that red tail. And the one on the right here was actually taken just a few years ago at the intersection of Lincoln and Windsor Road. If anybody knows where those roads are here in town, there's kind of a power substation out there at that intersection. And this bird would often hang out there for about 10 years. And I think it probably passed on. I don't think it's there anymore. It hasn't come back the last couple of years, but it had been coming for about 10 years straight every year. But it's called an intermediate morph. It's got kind of a cinnamon colored kind of a bib on it, but it's another form of this, what you see here. There's also a form of red-tailed hawk that's almost pure black that you'll see out west. Those are called Harlan's hawks. These are more intermediate morphs, but you can see them occasionally. This is another buteo. These are in the same genus as red-tailed hawks. This is actually what's called a rough-legged hawk. Rough-legged hawks, I'm going to zoom in a little bit on the left image here. If you look very closely, I guess it's going to cut it off. I'm going to zoom back out. If you look very closely at its feet, you can see a hint that there's feathers covering its shins. The feathers go all the way down. Pretty much the only thing you see are its toes. And that's why it's called a rough-legged hawk. On most red-tailed hawks and things like that, you'll see the shins and the feet completely exposed. On these are more northern Arctic species, so you only see them in the winter. Typically, if it's really cold, you'll see more of these. I haven't seen too many of them in the last couple of years, but in previous years, we've seen a lot more of them. The one you see on the left, I actually got on the north side of town over by St. Thomas More School, and it actually perched in an ornamental tree, and it didn't seem to know that to be afraid of a human. I was able to get relatively close with my 400 millimeter lens and get decent pictures of it. The ones on the middle on the right are also rough-legged hawks, but they're actually two different morphs. Remember I showed you that the red-tailed hawks can have different morphs, different races? The one in the middle is what you call a light morph, and they have really intricate patterns if you see them up in the air. You can see the almost look like concentric rings in its wing pattern, so they're really pretty. That was actually the first one I ever saw, and I saw this down in Douglas County, just driving in the winter out on the country roads, and saw this bird flying up high, and I'd never seen anything like it, and that was the first one I saw. The one on the right is also a rough-legged hawk, but notice you don't see any hint of any rings. It's more of a solid dark color. But in both cases, if you look at the tail, it's got a thick dark band at the tip, and then white kind of where the tail extends into the rump. And that's kind of indicative of the rough-legged hawk. But the one on the right is a dark morph, and the one on the left is the center is a light morph. The one over here is also a light morph. I only have one of these. There are actually, this is one of my challenging areas that I haven't actually been able to do very well yet. This is actually a type of sparrow. Most people think sparrows, oh, those are just boring little brown jobs. And so there's actually quite a few sparrows that are not very common to see. You're not typically going to see them show up at your feeder. This particular one, I'm going to zoom in here. This is called a clay-colored sparrow. It's the only one I've ever seen. It's the best picture I have of one. And it was actually taken at the beginning of one of our bird walks right at the entrance to Busey Woods. There's a number of other odd sparrows that often show up at places like, does anyone know where Weaver Park is in Urbana? Weaver Park has actually kind of become a pretty good area for birding because they bought it originally with the goal of building soccer fields, and it took them so long to actually get around to doing it that the stuff kind of grew up, and it became kind of a grassland, marshy area, and it became a great place. So when they finally decided to start doing soccer stuff, there was a bunch of uproar. And so they've actually made some agreements to keep part of Weaver Park untouched. So that's good. They're still going to put some soccer stuff in, I think, but that's good for us. But there's a lot of interesting sparrows. They hang out a lot in the grassland. So if you can find areas that are untouched and haven't been turned into cornfields and soybean fields, but go back to the original grass, you can get things like Nelson's sparrows, LeConte's sparrows, and Harris's sparrows. I've not seen any of those, so unfortunately this is the only rare sparrow that I have. It's a clay-colored sparrow. If you have feeders in your yard, or even if you don't, if you have your garage open, you're probably going to run into a wren. You've probably heard of Carolina wrens or maybe house wrens. Both of these will be found near your house. They're very loud, they're very brave. This, however, is a little bit less common than those. House sparrows are not here year-round, they're only here in the summer. Carolina wrens are here year-round. This is a winter wren. If you look very close, I'm going to zoom in more. Well, if you look at the center one, you can look, it's got a little bit of a hint of a little tan eyebrow there. A Carolina wren would have a really noticeable eyebrow, and this is much more subtle than that. You can see that the chest is kind of this dirty, mottled kind of tan color. A Carolina wren would be much more uniform and not really spotted. And if you look at the bird on the left, you can see how short the tail is. Of the wrens that I've seen, this is shorter than either the house wren or the Carolina wren. So in the winter, these guys are not super common. I have not seen one in a couple years, but Busey Woods used to be a great place to find them, and they actually sing a lot more than the other wrens do. It's a very interesting song. We're working on hopefully starting to collect an audio library like I have a visual library, but we haven't started that yet. It'd be nice to be able to play sounds of these things. Now, this talk is usually given this time of year for a reason. Usually in the spring is one of the most active time for most birders. Because in the spring is when you usually start to get insects coming back, and that means it brings birds that eat insects with it. And those are some of the most colorful and interesting birds to see. But they're often hidden in the brushes, they're hidden in the places where the bugs are, which is usually not where the people are. So in a sense, you could consider all of these warblers, this is a variety of that. This is a type, this is called a Blackburnian warbler. This is one of many types of warblers that will come through the area in the spring. And it's really hard in the fall. They do come back through in the fall, but they're all in their non-breeding colors and they all look the same. So they just call them confusing fall warblers because unless you're really good, it's really hard to identify them. But when you come through in the spring, they've all got their breeding and they're in a big rush to get up north to their breeding ground so that they can start nesting. And in the fall, they kind of meander and take their time to head back south. But there's about a 2-week window, usually in May, when a lot of the warblers come through in very large numbers. And hopefully, you get a good combination of timing and good weather that you can get out and see them as they're passing through. So these were both actually taken in our backyard. And the one on the right was actually taken, in a sense, that's even more unusual because usually by the time June rolls around, they've already moved through. They're done. And this one actually was taken in June. So it was actually after the migration season. So they're not common year-round. They're relatively common during the right season. But if you see one out of season, they're even more uncommon. So warblers can be considered uncommon because it's dependent kind of on the time of year. This is another warbler. This is one of the more uncommon ones for this area anyway. So usually if any of the birders find one of these, they'll send a text alert out and everybody that's available and not at work will grab their cameras and try to find it. And this is called a black-throated blue warbler. And so if you look, these aren't great pictures because every time I've seen one, it's in really bad lighting. It's usually in Busey woods when all the leaves are out, and so there's just not much light, and you've got this little bird constantly moving looking for bugs, and so they're almost always slightly motion blurred. I'm still working to try to get a much better picture. A guy that I know a couple years ago, he was standing on a bridge in Busey woods and had one landed on the railing of the deck right next to him, and he got perfect pictures. I was so jealous. But these were both taken, I think, the one on the left was taken in Busey woods, and the one on the right was taken in Crystal Lake Park. So both in kind of the same general area. One more warbler here. I think this is the last of the warblers. There's so many warblers, I can't include them all. This is one that's a little bit more uncommon just because it's shy. When the warblers come through, these guys come through with them, but they're hard to see because they're not one of the ones that's likely to come out very often. This is called a morning warbler. Morning as in it's sad, not as in it's early in the morning. Although the best time to look for most warblers is in the morning. That's unrelated. Anyway, the morning warbler you can see here, it's got kind of a yellow belly, it's got a black bib and a gray head, and kind of a little bit of a dark mask there. I've only seen a few, and the few I've seen, obviously, you can see, like I said, they hang out where the bugs are. The bugs are in the shrubs, they're in the shade, and if you go in there, you're gonna get eaten up by mosquitoes, because that's what they're eating. They're getting the caterpillars off the leaves, and they're eating mosquitoes and things like that. And so it's often really hard to get pictures of any of these warblers because they're constantly moving. They're not like a cardinal that's gonna sit there and pose for you. So the ones that hang out in the lowest light conditions are the most challenging to get pictures of. Oh, one more warbler. This is one that I actually, sorry, there are so many warblers. This is one that I actually had not seen until this past year. In certain areas, they're probably more common. I've just never seen one around here. This is called a worm-eating warbler. This was not seen in Busey Woods. It was not seen in Crystal Lake Park. It was actually seen over on University Avenue at the NCSA building. What's the name of the building? Anybody remember? Anyway, pretty much right off University, just north of campus. And it was in the mulch outside the building. What we think happened was the thing was probably migrating through and hit one of the buildings and stunned itself. And it just kind of waited all day and hung out there for one day, just hopping around in the mulch. And I was able to get out there right after 5 o'clock before it got too dark and got some pictures of this thing hopping around, and it was gone the next day. So sometimes you have to be quick. If somebody reports one of these birds being around, you can't just wait until, oh, I want to wait till the weekend and then I'll go see it. No, it'll be gone. So this one I got lucky to finally get one. Another warbler. I keep forgetting all the warblers that I have. This is another one that I really like these guys because they kind of pop when you see them. They're very bright yellow except for this black bib and hood that they have on them, and that's why they're called a hooded warbler. These are not very common around here. They can be seen. If you do see them, they typically like the wetter areas. So if you have like woods with water in them and things like that, that's kind of the area that they like. They might like wetlands a little bit more. These are more common in like the southeastern United States near Georgia, where you have a lot of kind of that swampy area out there, the stuff near the coast. So they do come up here. They're not as common here as they are in that area. So if you go to the right areas, these would probably be a lot more common. But here we get excited every time we see a hooded warbler. And the ones I've seen have almost all been in Busey woods when I see them. One more. I think this is the last warbler. This is another one called a Connecticut warbler. Not super common around here, and it's another one of these, if they are there, they're secretive, so you don't usually see them. This one here decided to sit still, which was very odd for any warbler, and he sat there for about 10 minutes in one spot preening in front of the camera. But he was in some of the worst lighting you could possibly imagine, hidden by all these sticks and leaves. So I only got a handful of pictures, and the rest were terribly motion blurred, even though he was sitting right in front of me. So warblers are fun to go for, but they're... Sure. Let's go with the one on the left first. Well, let's go with the one on the right. If you look closely, he's got a very dark head. He's got very prominent white eye rings. But underneath, he's mostly a kind of a bright yellow. From a distance, they actually look like another type of warbler that we get in the area that's much more common called a Nashville warbler. But it's got a much darker head, and it has got this really prominent eye ring. Sometimes they're easier to find if you know bird calls really well. You listen for a Connecticut warbler and follow the sound, and then try to look for it, because the chances that you're going to see one first is not likely. I've only seen one, but hopefully I'll get another chance to see one. All right, finally we're past the warblers. All right, so this is a bird that I think this was 2 years ago. First one of these that I've seen. Not very common in this area because it's a wetland bird, and we don't have a lot of wetlands locally. There's Weaver Park. These birds have been seen there. It's called this is called an American bittern, B-I-T-T-E-R-N. This is odd because it was not seen in a typical wetland. We just 2 years ago had a pretty wet spring in Busey Woods, and you had all these almost like vernal pools that stuck around longer than usual, and this guy decided to hang around for about a week. And in fact, I saw him out in the swampy area, got off the trail to try to get a better picture and leaned up against a tree very slowly so I wouldn't spook it. And I started getting scared because he kept walking toward me. And I didn't want to be the guy that spooked the bird off. But once he started walking toward me, I definitely didn't want to stand up because then I would spook it off. But I was able to get some really good pictures of it as it kind of came up closer. Usually these guys will hang out in the reedy areas of grass near a wetland pond, and they will stick their beak straight up in the air. And you can see the streaks they have on their neck. They will blend right in. They just look like the grass. So they're usually really hard to see. They're kind of, if you've ever seen a great blue heron, structurally the bird looks very similar, except they tend to walk with their beak straight up in the air a lot more than a great blue heron does. And so when they're in their grassy environment, though, you won't hardly see them because they don't move much. They kind of look down with their beak straight up in the air. They look down into the water, and then they'll suddenly dive down and grab a fish or a frog. Okay. If I remember right, this weekend, they are having a woodcock walk. Now, woodcock is a relatively common bird, but I'm putting them in the uncommon category because they're really hard to see. Has anybody here ever heard of a snipe hunt? Did you know snipe are real? Often people think that snipe are imaginary and that it's a joke when you send somebody on a snipe hunt. That's usually when somebody says, I'm sending you on a snipe hunt, they think it's a fool's errand. You're never going to see it. But snipe are real. But on the screen here, I've got two different birds, actually. The one on the left that you see huddled down in the grass is actually it's a woodcock, also called a timberdoodle. That's another one of the nicknames they give it. The bird on the center and the right are actually called Wilson's snipe. And they like, the ones on the left and the center, they like muddy, wet areas. They usually come through in the spring when you've got like wet, flooded fields. They will bury that long beak down into the mud looking for worms and snails and things, and that's what they typically eat. The bird on the left is related. It has a very similar body structure. You can't see it very well because it's hidden down in the grass, but this is the best picture. I've seen them many times. And the same thing with snipe. Because they blend into their environment, you can see even with the snipe in the middle how much he blends into that grass he's hidden behind. They blend into their environment, so when you're walking through these grassy areas, you're more likely to have a bunch of them fly up out of the grass and scare the crap out of you. So you just don't see them very well, but they're actually quite common. And the woodcock, they actually come out at dusk when the light's failing. But you can often hear them. They sound meh, meh, meh. So if you ever go out around sunset in the early to mid-spring and you hear that sound around sunset, that's actually woodcock. And if you go to Meadowbrook Park, just as the light's failing, your eyes do a better job than the camera will, you can see these things fluttering and landing all around you. And they're often calling to each other. In fact, this weekend, I believe they do have a woodcock walk. So check the Champaign County Audubon Society website for the times. But I think it's probably in Meadowbrook Park, but I can't swear to that. So double check that if you're interested. But the snipe, unlike the woodcock hangs out in the woods, which is why it's called a timberdoodle. The ones on the left, even though they're related, they're different species, they hang out in wet, muddy wetland areas. The picture in the middle, by the way, was taken by my wife out of our car window. We were driving out on Curtis Road, and we actually saw one down in the ditch, and it just stood there and let her take pictures of it. So best picture of one I ever had was taken by her. Also during migration, as with many things that migrate, they're not common year-round. They only come through during migration. You get a lot of interesting ducks, waterfowl species that come through. The one that I'm focusing on here is the one you see on the left. The color is not quite as vibrant as it would be if it was on, say, on your computer screen right in front of you, but it's a very deep red. It's called a cinnamon teal. And there's several different types of teal that will often come through. They're very small ducks. The picture on the right shows two different types of teal. The one on the right is much more common. It's a blue-winged teal. They're kind of pretty in their own right. They've got this kind of leopard print feather pattern, and then when they take off, they've got these blue patches on their wings. But the one on the left is the cinnamon teal. They are not very common here at all. They're very deep red. I'm going to zoom in onto the one on the left here. If you look very carefully, you can see it's got a very red eye as well. It's kind of hard. These are not super high resolution pictures. They were kind of made to fit into the memory of the system. And so zooming them up doesn't make them any sharper. It just makes them bigger. So, but you should be able to make out the eye there. It's the only one I've ever seen. At the intersection of Mattis and Bloomington Road, if you go just west of that intersection, there's kind of a little industrial building back there with a pond in front of it. A few years, about 3 years ago, I think, this duck landed in that little pond there. This is called a long-tailed duck. This is something that does occasionally come around. We don't have a lot of ponds around here. The ones we do tend to be like at apartment complexes and very small. They tend to not attract a huge amount, but sometimes we get lucky as they're passing through and that's all they have. So they'll land there, and if you know about them, you can go and get a picture of them. If you go to places like Lake Charleston, you're more likely to get these birds, but they're further out. So you got to have a spotting scope to see them. So the benefit of them landing in these small ponds is they typically are a little bit closer to the shoreline, and if you have a decent camera, you can get good pictures of them. This was actually on a drizzly day, so unfortunately the lighting wasn't great, but you can still see that it has a long tail kind of sticking out the back end there. And on the right there, you can see how black its wings are when it kind of flutters its wings. Another waterfowl. This is sometimes called a sea duck. These are a form of duck that typically you're going to see on the coast, sometimes in the Great Lakes. Very heavy bills. This is called a surf scoter, S-C-O-T-E-R. The one on the left is an immature or a female, so it does not have the breeding colors. This was taken a few years ago at one of the little apartment ponds in Urbana, not too far from the Aldi's over there on 130 and University. The picture on the right was actually taken just this spring, just a few weeks ago. So this was actually about 12 of them, obviously not as close as I was to that first one. These were, does everybody know where River Bend is in Mahomet? River Bend State Forest Preserve? There's actually several lakes out there. It's kind of a gravel pit area, but it actually attracts some pretty interesting waterfowl sometimes. And this was actually a group of about 12 surf scoters that showed up. And if you look closely, this one here is a male. And he's got this breeding color. He's got kind of an orange bill with white stripes. And he's got that white mark on his forehead. And there's in this group, it's mostly females, but you've got 1, 2, and maybe, yeah, the far right one I think might be 2. Some of these might be in transition. They're not full adult, but they're kind of transitioning into the breeding colors. But the one here was obviously the one that was furthest along. So, but not a very common duck to find around here, just because they're typically found on coastlines and things like that. Thank you. There's also white-winged scoters and I think a couple other varieties that I have yet to see. Now, this is a bird you might expect to see in Egypt or something like that. It just doesn't look like something you would find around here. The bird you see on the left, if you go to Old Church Road in Savoy, there's an eagle's nest out there. And along that road there's a cornfield that often floods. Although I think they've fixed the drainage, unfortunately, so unfortunately I don't think it floods anymore. It was a great place to go for water birds. I don't think it'll repeat, but the bird on the left was taken at that location. As you can see, it's got a white face. This is a white-faced ibis, another of these kind of wetland birds that hangs down in wet areas. I get excited about these because we just don't have a lot of wetlands around here. And so if you get a wet spring that floods these fields, sometimes as these birds are migrating through, they have somewhere they can stop. And so it's good to always look at these flooded fields and stuff for interesting birds. So that's the only adult one that I've seen. The bird on the right might be, and I have to emphasize that, might be the same type of bird in non-breeding colors. The problem is there's another bird that is very similar to it called a glossy ibis that never gets the white face. So when they're immature, you cannot tell visually whether or not they are white-faced or glossy ibis, unless you do like a genetic test on one. Once again, more wetland birds. The bird on the left is called well, they're both the same bird, just the one on the right's in flight. This is called a Hudsonian godwit. So a lot of these shorebirds look very similar. They have long legs. They're wading birds. They tend to go through shallow water looking for snails and that kind of a thing. They've got these long beaks, not unlike the snipe that I showed you earlier. They've got these long beaks kind of designed for going down into the mud and looking for things. But these godwits often have kind of a long beak that's slightly upturned and these long legs. It's one of the bigger one of these shorebirds. Not very common for the Hudsonian godwits that you're seeing here. And here on the right, you can see one flying over a mallard. And this is another godwit. The one on the left is a little bit bigger. It's called a marbled godwit. You can see it's digging its beak down into the water, down into the mud below it, and most of its legs are hidden by the water, but with those long legs it can kind of stand up above it and just look for the stuff down in the mud. Neither one of the godwits are very common in this area. And the picture on the right has the godwit on the far left. You can see it's got that long bill, slightly upturned. The marbled godwit's on the left. And the bird in the center is actually a different bird. It's a little bit more common. It's called a lesser yellow legs. Very descriptive. And the bird on the right, it's not a very good picture, and I wasn't focusing on it. I'm not quite sure what it was. It almost looks like a type of duck called a merganser, but I can't be positive about that. It wasn't the focus of the picture, so it's not the best for identification purposes. This is a picture that was just taken last year, and it was I think it was 2 years ago. Very odd bird for this area. This is a Florida bird. It's called a limpkin. And it's actually quite big for birds of these wading types. They eat mussels, but they're typically found only in the warm waters off Florida. And for whatever reason, 2 years ago, a bunch of them came north, and one was even seen in like New Zealand. One went up to near Chicago, and the thing is, it didn't know to migrate. It found its way up here, and then when it started getting cold, it didn't know that it should turn around and go back where it's supposed to go from, and unfortunately it passed away. I think it froze to death. But this one was actually found at Lake Charleston. And you can see the picture on the right there, it actually found a mussel hidden down in the shallow water there. Only one I've ever seen. Everybody's probably seen, well, maybe not everybody, depends, like I said. Birders have definitely seen this. Most of you have probably seen them flying. They look like pterodactyls. The big bird standing on the upper right is a great blue heron. Those are very common around here, especially if you're paying attention. But if you notice the little white bird down to the bottom right, that's a little blue heron. So you got a great blue heron and a little blue heron, but that's an immature little blue heron. And so it's not blue, it's white. I've never seen an adult little blue heron. I think they're more southern birds. So usually, for whatever reason, the only ones I ever see up here are the immature ones, and they're pure white. And on the left here, you can see a better picture of it. So you can see it's got kind of greenish legs, and it's got that kind of nondescript eye that's got kind of a gray teardrop area there. But other than that, it's just kind of a white bird with kind of greenish legs. Now I'm going to go forward. And now we have another bird that looks very similar. This was taken at Lake Charleston. On the left is a much better look. This is called a snowy egret. Now if you look here, the teardrop area near the eye, see how it's yellow? And here the legs, they're dark legs, but the feet are yellow. So that's what differentiates an immature little blue heron from a snowy egret. You have to look very close sometimes with these birds, because some of these birds can be very confusing. And here on the right, I just kept this picture in here because it's an interesting comparison of the three different types of birds that are easily confused. You've got a great egret on the far right. It's like a great blue heron, but it's pure white. So it's the biggest one. The bird in the middle is the snowy egret, and the bird on the left is the little blue heron. So three different species of birds that are all pure white and kind of the same body structure. They were all hanging out on the dam, the spillway at Lake Charleston, grabbing fish as they washed over. These birds, the one on the left is far more common than the one on the right. Does anybody have a guess what these are? Not a grouse. Whippoorwill. So the one on the right is a whippoorwill. It's an eastern whippoorwill. The one on the left is in the same family, but it is not a whippoorwill. They're all in the same family of nightjars. The one on the left is a common nighthawk, and it's actually much bigger. This bird, when it's flying, is probably about the size of a Cooper's hawk, if you've ever seen a Cooper's hawk. But when they settle in during the day, they kind of blend into the trees, and you don't see them that much. But I actually got one at eye level near St. Thomas More School last year, and it sat there and opened its eyes for the camera. But that's a much bigger bird. The one on the right is tiny. It's the same body style. They've got this tiny little beak that protrudes out, and they look like little dragons. But the ones on the right are not very common anymore. They used to be a lot more common than they are now. Older people used to say that they would hear them constantly at night and stuff. I had never heard one before. But finally somebody reported one in BC Woods, and I rushed over, and it was actually perched in the same tree they reported in. If you catch them sleeping during the day, that's better. There's actually another variety I've never seen too called a Chuck Will's widow. that actually looks a lot like the whippoorwill, but it has a totally different call. And one was reported in Urbana last year, and I got there like 15 minutes too late. It quit calling about the time I pulled up, and so I didn't get to hear it, unfortunately. This is basically an Arctic finch. It's called a common redpoll. Up there, they're very common. They are not very common here, but sometimes if you get a really cold winter, it will push Arctic birds down south, and they really like sweet gum trees. So the sweet gum tree, you can see on the left there, they've got those little spiky balls. There's seeds in there that these guys they love. And so often if you see a sweet gum tree in a really cold winter, go up, and if you see like a flock of goldfinches, which are very common around here, look really close and you might see something that looks like this. And this is a common redpoll. It's got a red forehead and that kind of red bib.
Can you zoom in up?
Sure. The one on the left? So at first glance, you might confuse that with a house finch that will come up to your feeders and stuff, but it actually, house finches don't typically have that red spot on their forehead and just the red collar. They've kind of got their front, oops, sorry about that. Their whole front is usually red. This guy just has kind of a red kind of collar bib. That's it. But have not seen one in a couple years, but we actually had quite a few. It was kind of an eruption of them a couple years ago. The one on the right is more of a female or immature, so it doesn't have the color mixed in. This is a bird, it's actually quite common, but you almost never see them in your backyard. You've got to go out into the rural areas in the winter. Usually it's better when there's snow covering the fields. And what they will do is they'll often come up near the roadsides looking for weed seeds. And they actually eat the seeds off of the snow at the edge of roads. This is called a horned lark. They're actually here year round, but they're much easier to see in the winter. And you can see why they're called a horned lark. Their feathers make it look like they have horns on their head. They almost look like Batman. Except they're white, not dark. They got a little bit of yellow on them. So if you get a really good one, those horns are sticking up nice, the feathers. But yeah, you got to get out onto the rural roads to see these guys usually. Now, I've kind of mixed birds here because they hang out together. On the right picture there, that's another horned lark without its horns being very noticeable. But that's the horned lark right there. The bird in the back behind it and the bird you see over here are both the same type of bird. This is called a Lapland longspur. This is another, Lapland is kind of an Arctic tundra, and so these birds are typically a northern bird that occasionally, once again, during cold winters will come down and they'll do mixed flocks with the horned larks. So you have to look very closely at these little birds that fly along the side of the road as you're driving down country roads, and look closely at them if you're lucky enough to let them get close, because often they'll fly away before you get a good view. Another type of longspur besides the Lapland longspur is this bird. It's called a Smith's longspur. Not quite as, they don't like the snowy environment quite as much, but it's still very early spring when you usually see them. At a distance, you might think they're a robin just because they have that kind of rusty breast, but they actually will, they're hard to see. You go out there in the fields before anything's turning green, you can see there's only a hint of some green weeds coming up here, but the fields are all still down, and you just look for the ground to move. And it's like you don't see them with your eyes because the colors don't jump right out and see you, but you'll see a whole bunch of them just kind of crawling. At first you might think it's a bunch of mice, but if you look very carefully, you might see some of these guys. These were all taken southwest of Champaign, out in the rural roads. The one on the right's an immature or a female. And this is, once again, this is a mixed flock. But the bird on the left is kind of the focus here. This is another one that will hang out in these mixed flocks in the winter. It's called a snow bunting. They look like little clown birds. They've got little rosy cheeks, and they're mostly white with just a little bit of hints of color there, but all the birds in the background are pretty much Lapland longspurs, but hidden amongst them was a few of these snow buntings. And the picture on the right's more typically what you would see, but you have to look very closely to see the snow buntings hidden in. So the two kind of in the center back are, yeah, that one there and that one there. Those are snow buntings. There's another one to the right there, and then another one, I think, to the right of that right there. And the rest of them, I think, are all Lapland longspurs. Nondescript, non-initiated person might call them all sparrows, but if you know, they're not. This was actually taken on campus where 4th Street, I don't remember the side street, but if you come from Windsor Avenue onto 4th Street and drive in a little bit and take a right, there's like a grain silo, kind of on the west side of campus. What is it, St. Mary's? Yeah, St. Mary's Road and 4th Street. There's a grain silo there, and a bunch of grain had been spilled out there, and almost all the pictures I've shown you in these last few pictures were taken right there. They were all going after the grain that had been spilled. So I didn't even have to go into the rural areas to find this bird, but normally that's where you would go. Another bird you will often see in the winter here if you drive out to the rural areas. They are endangered here in Illinois, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're uncommon. If you drive around a lot of those rural roads, you're probably going to find one. The one on the left is a male. The one on the right is a female. These are called northern harriers. If anybody's familiar with military, you've heard of a Harrier jet. It was actually named after these birds. These birds, what they'll do is they're more of a grassland bird, and they don't really have a lot of their native habitat left because everything's been turned into cornfields. But they used to cruise out over open grasslands going for mice and stuff, and they would hunt more by sound than sight. And so the pictures don't show it very well, but their eyes have kind of a disc, kind of like an owl does. And what it does is as they're flying over the fields, it acts like a parabolic antenna that catches sound waves and funnels it to their ear so they can hear very well because of the eye discs that they have kind of funnels the sound that direction. The one on the left is a male. They're often called a gray ghost because the back is silvery gray and the underside is white. The females are a little bit more common. I see them more often than I do the males, but they often fly very low over the fields. Unlike red-tailed hawks and Cooper's hawks, which fly higher, they almost never perch, or if they do, not for very long. They're usually flying low and slow over the fields. They got a white patch right above where their tail meets their rump. Short-eared owls, another bird you'll see here in the winter sometimes in the same area where you see harriers. So that one there was east of Urbana, and the one on the left here I found actually southwest of Champaign just this past winter. And you've got short-eared owls, now we've got long-eared owls. Very uncommon owl in this area. They only migrate through. The one on the right was taken in our backyard. I got very lucky with that. And the one on the left was taken at Kaufman Lake a few years ago. About the size of a house cat. They're not the biggest owl, but definitely smaller than a great horned owl. Snowy owls. This is something that usually every winter I try to find at least one. So you got to be on the right lists and stuff to know where they're at, but they'll usually hang around for a week or two in a given area so you can go hunting for them, but they don't stay necessarily put. You often have to drive around. But pure white, often you'll get confused if you see a white plastic bag out there. So more often than not, that's what it turns out to be. Prairie falcon, very uncommon in this area. There's only a couple that actually visit Coles County to the Magic Stump area. If anybody saw the documentary that they ran at the Virginia a couple years ago, this one we actually saw in Douglas County, so between here and Coles County. It's the only one I've ever seen, actually. But prairie falcons are a western bird. We have other falcons like peregrines that are coming back here, but the prairie falcon is not a bird that's common in this area. All right, two more pictures. I got this one here. This is a Mississippi kite, called Mississippi kite because they're more common in the lower Mississippi Delta area and kind of up into the Mississippi River area. The further you get away from that area, the less common they are, but they're about the size of a Cooper's hawk, but they have a white head. They eat insects. They were going after the cicadas this last year because we had all those cicadas that emerged, and they were flying right over our heads. The one on the right was taken from my backyard on a really rainy, misty day, and the one on the left was taken from about 20 feet away. It was perched in a tree in Robeson Park in southwest Champaign. And I think this is the last picture. This is another kite called a swallow-tailed kite, and in 2015, this bird got very famous. We even had signs that were put out on I-57 telling people this way to the swallow-tailed kite. This is a Florida bird. You almost never see it up here, but it actually spent about a month in southwest Champaign near the intersection of Windsor and Mattis. And haven't seen one since, but it would just grab cicadas out of the air and dragonflies and would eat them while it was flying, and occasionally it would perch like on the right, and I was able to get pictures of it preening. So that's all the pictures. So